first thing I want to do is sort of thank my collaborators. Dan Goldstein's been involved in a lot of this work. He's at LBS, but actually right now he's spending a year or two at Yahoo Labs. Actually, luckily for me in New York, not out in Mountain View, but that's great. Isaac Dinar and Kyrie Liu have been PhD students at Columbia, and my German collaborators are Andreas Hermann and Mark Heitman. The basic idea I want to convince you of is there's something really special about doing nothing. And I want to use the phrase no action defaults in part for a very simple reason. When you say defaults now in the current economy, people think of something else. But no action defaults is the option that's selected when no active choice is made. Now we're all familiar with these. If you surf the web, almost every website presents you with a no action default. It might be pre-clicked or not clicked, but something happens if you just go to the next page. Defaults work a lot of different ways. Because they're so robust, there has to be lots of things going on. And there's at least 3 things we've thought a lot about. The first is they work by inertia or laziness. People will just not make a choice and they get whatever the marketer or the public policy maker decides for you. A second thing is actually a little bit close to what Noah was just talking about, implied endorsement. Maybe this is what most people do, or this is what whoever is asking the question thinks I should do. The third thing, which is actually I think very important, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, is they work by a mechanism that psychologists and economists call loss aversion. That if I have this, I can think more about the advantages of what I have and less about the advantages of the other option. There's a focusing. I think of what I have immediately, like a mug in an endowment effect experiment, immediately as being better. And I'll talk a little bit when I talk about what causes these effects. The sort of bottom line, particularly for people who are doing this in the real world, is twofold. One is this is a powerful technique. And the second thing, it's a very inexpensive technique. I'll show you cases where by changing 2 lines of HTML code, you can change behavior radically. So that sounds good, particularly in times when governments don't have a lot of money. So let me start by a series of case studies. I also want to do 2 things before I get into the case studies. One is I want to thank all of the people who are on the social side here for all the good work you're doing. So that's, we get to talk about it. It's nice to see people do it. And second, I want to thank both Frank and Jennifer. I postdoced here a long time ago, and it's great to come back to Stanford. I was lucky enough to postdoc with Amos Tversky, and so a lot of the ideas that you're going to hear today will have an echo from there. Okay, the first piece is something I got interested in when I had a small realization. I realized when I was traveling with and talking to European friends, something really unusual happens. If you're in certain countries in Europe, you are an organ donor by default. You have to choose not to be. Of course, in the US and lots of other countries, the reverse is true. So having done earlier work, I wondered, could this possibly actually make a difference? So Dan and I sat down and decided to do 3 studies. In the US, there are now 100,000 people on the waiting list for organ donations. We all know there's a black market, for organs. Yet 81% of Americans actually, when they say in general, approve of organ donation. Yet at the time we started the study, 28% actually checked the little box on their card. So there's a real gap between sort of attitudes and actions here. And as I said, there's these 2 kind of defaults that exist in the world. The first are called, in the medical world, explicit consent, or we call these opt-in. You have to choose to be a donor. The other is presumed consent, is how doctors talk about it. We think of that as opting out. Notice that basically the same 2 options, you can easily change from one to the other. You just have to choose what you want. So I want to use this as a little case study because I think there's 3 different ways to think about this. Economics is an analysis of this. I want to offer a diagnosis and a treatment. In economics, basically, people don't derive enough value from organ donation. So what's the treatment? Give them incentives. So these incentives can be mild, like simply paying the funeral benefits for someone who's a donor. Perfectly fine, and not so mild. Gary Becker has actually advocated there be a market for kidneys. $10,000, you get a kidney. People may differ from that, but that's the economist's solution. Being someone who teaches marketing, I realize we talk about marketing persuasion all the time, and it could be the diagnosis people have the wrong attitude or beliefs, and that's something we can educate. So you see these little, donate for life, makes perfect sense. Although it tends to be expensive. And I guess what we started thinking was, how does psychology and behavioral economics talk about this? Here the diagnosis is that people don't have a well-constructed value. It's not like they have a utility for organ donation. They have a bunch of beliefs. And depending upon how the question is asked, they'll do different things. And so the treatment is you ask questions in a way that gives the answer they would give, particularly in this case, if they thought a lot. Remember, most people think donation's a good idea. They just don't take the action. The other thing that's really true in this when you start looking at literature, thinking about organ donation is not a pleasant thing. Because what are you imaging? your own death. It's, it's, now boy, this is talk about a buzzkill, taking the energy out of this room, but that's what it's like. Okay, so we started with a set of studies with this notion of constructed preferences. First thing was a web study with real people, and we asked essentially the following question. You're moving to a new state, and in that state, everybody is, in the opt-in condition, not an organ donor unless they choose to be. Click here if you want to be a donor. In this state, everybody is a donor unless they choose not to be. Click here to not become a donor. And we had a third condition, which is great to do on the web. You basically couldn't go beyond this page until you made an active choice. Okay, so this was interesting because it basically engaged them in the choice process. Now what's fascinating here is, in the opt-in condition, this is roughly what you see in the US, about now, today, 42% agree to be donors. In the opt-out condition, 82% agreed to be donors. So what's really interesting here is the third column, though. What's the third column? It's when you force people to make the choice, they're a lot more likely to become donors. There actually is no statistical difference between these two bars. That is, if you force people to make a choice, they will become a donor. But unless they're forced, they won't. Is that clear? Now, this is a hypothetical study, lots of criticisms you could have for it, but that was our first study. We then, and Dan was very important, Dan's multilingual and has spent a lot of time in Europe. We started contacting the registries in a number of European countries to see what the percentage of people were in each country agreed to be a donor. And this, my friend Dick Thaler says this will be on my tombstone because this graph gets taught now in MBA classes, which is great. But what's interesting is you don't need to do any fancy statistics. The yellow bars are the countries you have to opt in to be a donor. The green bars are the countries you have to opt out not to be a donor. Okay, so this is, passes the intraocular trauma test. And actually what's interesting is there are countries here that, my wife is German, so I always get a little grief when I say this, are somewhat similar. Germany and Austria. Or perhaps Belgium and the Netherlands, or I can insult lots of Europeans, but there are clearly similarities between these countries that are overwhelmed by the difference between opt-in and opt-out. The little story, the Netherlands actually, I had a Dutch postdoc, actually wanted people to become donors. Every home got a form to become a donor, a little booklet saying why you should become a donor, and that worked, got them up to 27.5%. But that's still, a third to a quarter of what Sweden, which is the lowest level. So even with the education, there wasn't a lot of effect. So this was great. The question we then asked, and we were lucky enough to get data, was does it actually make a difference in the number of organs transplanted? We were lucky enough to get data for 10 years from a number of European countries, and actually we could actually do something like econometric modeling. I'm not an econometrician, I don't play one on TV, but we got right enough answers as of other people. So basically here, the dependent measure is how many people were actually donors upon their death. And what we looked at was basically for the opt-in countries and the opt-out countries. And to give you a little bit of background, we added a number of control variables. It turns out, obviously, some countries put a lot more money into medical infrastructure, so that's in there. It turns out Catholics are more likely, surprise to me, more likely to be donors. Religion is in there. Education is in there. So there's lots of covariates. But when you do the analysis, basically, and it's been done now by two other folks, you get a 16 to 50% increase in the number of organs that are actually transplanted, simply by changing what the default is. So that's actually quite amazing and it was quite gratifying. I just want to not take the claim for this, but just point out this is research that actually people have talked about. In Argentina, they've actually changed the law for an opt-in to an opt-out. Israel just did a very strange change. They basically say, if you're willing to be a donor, you go to the top of the list. It's an incentive kind of model. And in Labour, I think I got the spelling right in Britain, Labour actually endorsed a change to the opt-out. And actually, they had done a meta-analysis that showed that opt-out actually does increase donation, agreeing with our results. That's run into a nasty little thing called elections. So I don't know if that will happen, but at least it's been proposed. Now, I'd like to stop, if there are questions. I'm going to talk about other case studies, but I don't mind having questions in the middle as well. Please.
Just kind of morally, I'm just wondering if you were to do the opt-out option, perhaps looking at communities of color or communities with language barriers, perhaps there might be situations where they don't know, they're not informed. Has any study been done on that area as well?
No, and it's obviously a really important consideration, but let me point out all those things sort of keep people from getting what they really want. And one of the questions that's really deep here, and we'll talk about in a second, is should defaults do what most people want most of the time? So if most people in a community want to be organ donors, why should not the default reflect that? So your point's very well taken, but there's a cost to having an there's an interesting, having an opt-in policy, which is there are people who want to be donors who aren't. And so there's an interesting question here about the relative cost of those. Please, Paul.
I find myself surprised to be raising normative questions, but I want to follow up on that one. Where you don't have a forced choice, on the organ donation in particular, there's an asymmetry, because there's some individuals whose religious beliefs actually
Absolutely.
prohibit organ donations, but they're likely to procrastinate or have inertia or make mistakes as much as anybody else. So this really is not a kind of morally symmetric problem. This particular one, some of the others may.
Right. Let me come back to a solution, but there are individual differences that we can predict in willingness, and maybe we should take advantage of that. I agree. Although I will point out that the asymmetry could be argued there are people who are dying because of the default. So I'm not sure where I tip on that balance. Please.
In your informative research, the demographics of the people that you were surveying homogeneous?
They
Because
were
it
a
does
web
make a
sample
difference
that
in
is
terms of-
actually relatively, it's not a U.S. national probability sample, but it's all sorts of people, including high proportion minorities, women.
Statistics I'm guessing that you use for the number of people, Americans, who are interested in being organ and tissue
Oh,
donors.
that's Gallup poll.
That's, yeah, and I'm familiar with that because
Right.
our organization was part of that Gallup.
Okay, good.
That asked to do that Gallup poll.
Right.
And it was a mainly homogeneous population.
Okay.
And the countries that you used to compare opt-in versus opt-out, again, homogeneous populations. And the point
that's
that you brought up
interesting. I
is
see,
very,
yeah.
very valid.
Yeah. No, that's certainly an important point. But I'm wondering whether the question is, does it interact, right? There's going to be all these main effects, but will it interact with that? I mean, there's certainly, let me move on, but just acknowledge this important point, please.
You put a lot of weight on the answer to the question, do I want to be an organ donor? As opposed to the action of, I'm going to donate more organs. I perceive that question to be instead, do you want to be perceived as somebody who answers a questionnaire that I am an organ donor? And it's not convincing to me that that connects with, I actually want to be an organ donor.
Which, if I'm understanding you correctly, which is why we have the data from Europe, which involves both consent rates and actual transplantations. So, the web survey is cute, but what is the real meat, I think, is the last. Real meat, okay. Oh, God. Let me move on and talk about a couple applications of defaults, if I might. So one of the areas that I find fascinating is individual savings behavior. Of course, if believe every consumer is rational, don't listen to the next 2 points I'm going to make. But we've had a system that has actively discouraged savings in the U.S. by making the default for savings until 2006 0. If you have a 401k plan, you walked in, and unless you actively chose to raise it, it was 0. There has been a change in the law in 2006 in the Pension Preservation Act, PPA, which actually allowed firms to change the default from 0 to something else. It's a little bit more complicated than the story I'm telling you. But here's one early study that helped get that legislation done. And this is by a set of economists, Rashirs, Troy, Laibson, and Madrian. They looked at a company that basically had a default of 0 and then raised it to 3%. What do we see? When it's raised to 3%, originally 42% of the people did not save anything. That number went down to 12%. And you see this huge peak at 3%. It says two things. One is people are paying attention to the default, and perhaps the default might even be too powerful. Many economists would say these folks should be saving at the max of what they should save, and in this case matched by the company of 6%. But in general, this is a great case where changing the default can actually change behavior. And again, I'd say what are the alternatives? 1, economics, give them an incentive. 2, marketing, educate them. Or 3, change the rules, and that increases savings much less expensively. probably the biggest success in behavioral economics is a plan due to Bernarzi and Thaler called Save More Tomorrow. In this plan, essentially, you promise that some part of your future raises will be put into savings instead of consumption. So if I'm going to get a raise of 4%, if only, but if I was going to get a raise of 4%, 2% might go into savings. This has been shown to increase savings markedly. What's interesting is that actually the default is once I sign up, I continue to be a member. So when I get the raise in a year after that, the same saving increase occurs. The year after that, the same. And this is what happens. Beforehand, people were saving essentially about 3.5%. After the first raise, that went up to 6. Second raise, that went up to 8. And so eventually, after 4 raises, this got up to a 14% savings rate. The fact it was sticky, the default was essentially to maintain membership in the plan, increase savings much more. And everyone argues this is a key principle of that plan. So if you want to increase savings, just make the membership automatic, and that will do it. Let me, since I looked at everyone's interest, and I've been very interested in environmental decisions, because I think like organ donation and like retirement savings, they're constructive values. We know lots of things about being green, but they can be contradictory. So let me give you an example. This is a study done by some Germans. Essentially, we all have choices now to choose between green energy suppliers and what they call gray energy suppliers. Suppliers who are actually using non-renewable sources. In Europe, between 50 and 90% of people say they will buy green energy with a small premium. When we say small, we mean what the market would charge. The reality is very different. 1% in Ireland, 0.4% in Finland, 1% in Germany, and 0.5% in the UK. But in Schonau, which is a conservative town in the Black Forest of Germany, it turns out 99.1% of the people buy green energy. Why? Well, it turns out in the days of Chernobyl, the folks in Schonau were really worried about nuclear power, so they brought the grid. This little town owned, essentially, the supplier, and they just changed the default from gray energy to green energy. Only 0.9% of the people opted out. It's a huge change. Why? And there's been some other field studies. Energy GmbH made green the default. 94% of the people who were given the green default maintained the default. Okay. Now this is very interesting because these are relatively inexpensive things in terms of consumer behavior. One of the cute things is they've actually these Germans have done a study where they actually give people in lab studies, very much like our organ data, a gray default, a green default, and a neutral default. Now, with the gray default, 35% choose the green supplier. With the green default, 70% do. But when you were forced to make a choice, you actually had to make a choice, what happened is that almost everyone chose the green. There's actually no difference. This is almost, I realized this morning, almost a direct echo of our organ donations. People, if they actually have to actively make a decision, do. But the default, including everything we know about opening up electric bills, reading the fine print, and actually sending it in, goes against that. They also did a little study where you either had to pay to go to green energy, or you had to be compensated to go from green energy to gray energy. This is a classic result of an endowment effect or loss aversion. They pay $6.50 to get, or euros, sorry, to get the green energy, but they would demand $13 to give it up. It's a pretty remarkable result. This is yet one more field study, about 6% versus almost 80%, depending what the default was. Okay. And we've been doing some work where we're actually interested in, do defaults make a difference in substantial decisions? So this is work with several grad students. What we're interested in is basically why incandescent bulbs are so popular. There's lots of ways of dealing with this. You can ban them, which is what the Australians have done. You could actually tax them, which is another possibility. But we're just wondering what would happen if the default light bulb became the CFL. So on the web, people come to our website. They say, will you please make a choice between these two with the following scenarios. Essentially, it says you've just had a new addition put to your house. The bulbs the contractor put in were either incandescent or fluorescent, CFL. And he'll come back tomorrow to change them. No problem, no charge to you at all. Which do you want? Okay, so it's just our way of introducing default. And we find a pretty strong effect. We find that when the incandescent is the default, that 44% of the sample stays with incandescent, when the CFL is the default, only 20% switch. That's not only statistically significant, but I'd argue substantially significant as well. I want to come back to this example in a few seconds, but so remember there's a big difference here. Okay, let me stop there and just see if there are any questions. So those are essentially, to me, the best public policy examples I'm going to use of the role of defaults. Please, Rick.
Going back to the first section, is there something that you can identify that differentiates countries that choose this opt-in strategy versus the opt-out?
Yeah, it's a very good question. What was there sort of something causal that caused the differences? And particularly when you look at Sweden versus Denmark, it's not obvious. And the answer is it seems to be a little bit like the social norms in Noah's case. People didn't think it would make a difference. So they I've done a fair amount of reading. There's been no systematic difference that anyone has talked about. It's actually quite interesting. Any other questions about defaults in public policy? One of the things that I think is also important is to realize companies affect consumer welfare by their choice of defaults. And so we've actually been doing both some analysis of existing and actually some essentially studies with some companies looking at how defaults change people's behavior on their websites. We were lucky enough, Barry Schwartz wrote up a bunch of this results in an op-ed piece in the New York Times, and it's great when the New York Times draws cartoons about your work. So this is essentially the tragedy of neglecting defaults. You didn't choose the plate option, you didn't choose the light start option, you didn't choose the wheels option, you didn't choose the leave, trees, shrubs, and flowers option. And the point here is often firms know what people want, yet they don't actively choose the right default. So sometimes consumers actually may even know less than firms. So we just did a little work with a company that I'm going to have to call because we can't tell you who it is, Glam, which I call the German large auto manufacturer. And this is their website in German. And I'm going to talk about one decision you make of the 56 decisions you make on their website. I mean, there are actually 56 separate choices you have to make to configure a car from Glam. And this is the engine option. I'm going to do that for one reason. It's the very first choice you see on their website, and it's an economically very important decision. This car with the smallest engine costs somewhere around 38,000 euros. This car with the biggest engine costs over 60,000 euros. So the effects I'm going to show you are costing people a lot of money. The other thing, since it's early on, people are actually paying attention, and all they have to do to switch is click. So we were very interested in this for a number of reasons. And one of the nice things Glam let us do is this is a real study on their configurator. 1 out of every 100 visitors to their configurator went to one of our manipulated websites. So this is the proportion of people choosing each of the engines when there's no default, where you force people to make a choice. You had to, if you didn't choose something, it said, please go back and choose an engine. And they're arranged roughly from the cheapest to the most expensive. And it's amazing. I mean, unlike any American car site, there are literally 16 different engines you can have. It's almost any possible combination of turbo, diesel, horsepower. It's quite amazing. Germans love to make choices about cars. So we actually then compared that to what the firm had done previously, which is always give people the cheapest default. And there is basically what happens if you see the green bars, that's the choices. Essentially, it's not actually a great deal for the firm because people actually, if you compare to the forced choice condition, they buy cars that are about 500 euros less expensive, just on the engine decision alone. Okay. For consumers, it's actually not always good because they don't always pick the cheapest. 25.6 get an engine that's different than if they were actually forced to make a choice. So it diminishes the welfare for the firm, and it diminishes welfare for the consumer. One thing that people who often think about default say is, how about if you simply give everybody the most popular option as the default? It makes a lot of sense, right? Because what I want to do is, if more people are going to pick this, it's the least harmful thing I can do. It's sometimes called benign default. In that case would be this engine. Well, we did that condition, and you see that basically the benign default got a huge increase. Okay? But for the firm, they would have loved this because it increased the average engine sold by 302 euros. Remember, this is just changing 2 lines of HTML code. For consumers, though, I think this is a terrible idea. When you look at it, 51.2% get a different engine they would have in the forced choice condition. So there really is a decrease in consumer welfare. So I just think, actually, this gets to what's really a hard question for people in this room. is easy when firms and consumers' welfare are aligned. The tough ones are cases like this where it may not be so obvious. But the important point here is we almost doubled the share of this engine simply by making it the default. I'm just going to give you a couple other of my favorite examples when businesses have done this. A large European railroad changed the default. If you ever travel in Europe, you can get a ticket to the train. That doesn't mean you're going to get a seat. You have to get off Deutsche Sitzplatz. You have to get a seat to reserve. Those typically cost €1 or €2. This large European railroad changed the default from being without a seat reservation to with a seat reservation. It increased their revenue $40 million, 40 million euros. But also what it did is consumer satisfaction went up because most people really wanted. This is a case where things were in line. They like having seat reservations. They just don't get around to it or don't think it's worth the money when they're buying, but they actually like it when they're sitting. We got involved in this originally when I was teaching at the Wharton School and living in Pennsylvania. In New Jersey and Pennsylvania adopted essentially a low-cost insurance alternative, which basically took away your right to sue. For our purposes, we'll call it the no-fault option. It was about $300 less expensive. New Jersey actually introduced it with the no-fault option being the default. In Pennsylvania, I've been told this was the trial lawyers, though I don't have evidence of this, lobbied to have the full tort option to be the default. Now, that happened, and so we can now compare how much insurance has been sold in New Jersey versus Pennsylvania. And according to Dan and I, we think there's $2 billion more insurance sold in Pennsylvania simply because the default was different. And my favorite example is AT&T, when it introduced the iPhone, had a default. The default was everyone who was excited was clicking by when not paying a lot of attention, is I want a hard copy of my bill. Now, who made that decision? Probably not a sophisticated marketer, probably an engineer or a programmer. And the bills were full of thousands of literally lines saying, you used data. Of course, data was free. So you used 1 kilobyte of data, cost 0. There was one person who actually got a bill, arrived in a 7-pound box, that was 300 pages long. Okay. Why the default at sign up was for itemized bill for the first time. Let me talk, because I think to a lot of these issues that you're concerned about is what's causing default effects. I think this is not just, it is of scientific interest, but it also goes to the morality of defaults. And we think of 3 possible things just to remind you. The first is effort or inattention, not paying attention. And in some cases, this is going to be a factor. In fact, we're going to argue there are cases where you can make the default more powerful by making it hard to change. But in lots of cases where we control for this, this isn't all that's going on. Receive a recommendation, the fact that the firm or the public policymaker is thinking this is the best thing for me is a possibility. And finally, the last thing is this notion of focusing on the default, looking at its advantages and the disadvantages of the other option, because it is the default. And I'll talk just a little bit about that at the end. Okay, so here's a case where I think it can't be much about laziness. From the Apple website, I have 1 gigabyte of memory. All I have to do to go to 2 gigabyte is click. Until we get brains imaging that actually can measure choices easily in front of a computer screen, this is as easy as it's going to get a response. All I have to do is move the mouse a couple inches and click. I don't think there's a way laziness could explain the kinds of effects we've seen. But firms and public policy makers sometimes realize or don't realize the effect of laziness. So there's lots of examples here. I just want to go to this one, which is until about a year ago, the FTC was going to make everybody re-register for the do not call list. Anyone here want phone calls during dinner from marketers? Raise your hand. Now, this is a case where the default should be clearly you're not. The default, by the way, is you have to register actively. You don't have to, I would argue you probably should have to opt in to get phone calls. Lydia Parnas, who was the FTC's Director of Bureau of Protection, said, it's so easy, we'll sign up in the first instance. It will be just as easy for them to sign up, to re-sign up. We did a couple back in the real calculations. Given that 90% of people don't want to get phone calls, that's about 1,000 person years of cost, by people just going to the website and so there is an issue here which I think is really important, which is defaults save people effort if you get them right. Implied endorsement, this is obviously something that happens pretty frequently. It could be the case that you're thinking this is the best thing for me, and actually Dell has my best interest in heart. just because this is such a good example, the state of Kansas changed the default for sex education. Like in most states, it used to be the case, if you were going to send your children sex education, that happened by default, and you had to send in a form not to. They changed the default the opposite, which is if you want to send your kid to get sex education, you had to opt in. I think there's laziness there, but there's also a strong sense of implied endorsement. They must really be talking about some pretty racy things if I have to sign a permission slip for my kid to go to sex education. So I think that's a case of implied endorsement. The final thing is I just want to give you a flavor of some other work we do. I think a lot of it has to do that defaults change the way we construct our values. And we've elaborated a fairly, I think, nice theory for this called query theory. And we've talked about it for the endowment effect. We've talked about it for intertemporal choice. But we also just published a paper where we look at query theory to do a related manipulation that every politician knows, and that is attribute labeling. The classic result is due to Irwin Levin, who basically said, we all see hamburger meat that's labeled 90% lean. None of it's ever labeled 10% fat. But, you know, they are the same thing. In fact, Irwin in his studies actually, at one point, was frying the hamburger in front of people and showed that they actually would pay different amounts for the 10% fat and the 90% lean. I'm glad I wasn't in the lab. But we noticed that for carbon fees, there were two kinds of frames that were out there. One is carbon offsets. The other was carbon taxes. And if you think about it, it's essentially the same transaction. And in our experiments, we wrote them as exactly the same thing. You pay more money, and you reduce the carbon consequences of your behavior. So we gave a bunch of consumers on the web questions about airline tickets, computers, electricity suppliers, and described the additional fee either as an offset or a carbon tax. The other thing we realized is this might have different effects on different political ideologies. For Democrats, perhaps tax had less negative consequences than it might be for independents and Republicans. And just to give you the bottom line result, these are the choices when the product was labeled as a tax in yellow or as an offset in blue. As you can see, taxes destroy purchasing of a carbon-reduced airline ticket, computer, whatever, for Republicans. But when they were labeled as offsets, there's no difference. Moreover, to the point of attention, we actually listen to people. We actually do type aloud protocols we call aspect listings. What are you thinking about as you're making this decision? And they think about, even Republicans, very different things in the tax frame and in the offset frame. In the offset frame, they think about the goods, and they don't think about the negative things about spending more money. In the tax frame, they say, you know, I could be buying a new car with that. You know, there's radically big differences in what they think about just with the attribute label. Okay. One last thing, and then I'll close. Obviously, everyone in this room, whoever designs a choice situation, is actually choosing defaults for people. And so this is actually a very good question of how do you set defaults. I'm just going to stop by giving you the cocktail party version of a Harvard Business Review article that we wrote. And the argument is basically, if you believe defaults have an influence on your customers, you basically have some interesting options. One option we talk about, and there's an incredibly complicated flowchart, is you can give everyone what we might call a mass default. You just pick the default you think that, on average, people would like. But to the point about differences in religion, differences in tastes, of course. So my favorite example actually is airbags, which are not a default, they're a law. What happens to someone in a car with an airbag? In most cases, their lives are saved. But is anyone injured by airbags? You know, small, statured people, kids, and more women. So there is a heterogeneity there, just like there's a heterogeneity in the case of religion, just like the heterogeneity in the other case. And in fact, John Graham, who was George W. Bush's regulatory czar, said airbags are pretty scary because what they do is they save large, he would say fat, men. And how do you get in an accident? Who's more likely to get into an accident? Someone who's been drinking. So basically, airbags are great if you want to save the lives of big, fat men who've been drunk. So that goes to a point which I think is really important, which is defaults have a side where they basically, if there's heterogeneity in taste, if people need different things, they actually, even setting the right default for everyone on average, lowers consumer welfare. So we've generated this other concept called a smart default. And so think about smart defaults as defaults that are focused on people's differences. In fact, if you sit in a car now, it actually measures how much how should I put this, your posterior weighs on the seat and just the explosive force of the airbag to that. It's a smart default. And I think in lots of cases, smart defaults will dominate mass defaults. One case that I'll just talk about that I think is incredibly interesting is that of financial services. I mean, if consumers need help, one of the cheapest ways of getting them that help is actually to set the defaults, but not a one-size-fits-all default, which some have argued for. But often firms know more about things like what would be a good mortgage for me than does the consumer. And so this would be a great example for smart defaults. Just a couple examples. They're pretty easy. Life cycle retirement funds, mortgage choice, and divestment decisions. I've worked with one firm that actually wants to customize annuities depending upon the person's age, marital status, and other savings. So that's a case where I think there's real synergies between the firm's interest and the person's interest. Okay, I think that will be it. Just let me sort of close with one comment. So we talked about 3 common ways of changing choices about consumption. One is changing incentive, lowering prices, increasing taxes. A second is changing attitudes, advertising and marketing. The third is changing what's now called the choice architecture. Defaults are one part of that. There's lots of other things that you could do. The interesting thing about the behavioral advantage is it works even if people do nothing. In fact, it often requires people to do nothing. And in doing so, it's actually a very inexpensive, easy to implement, and lots of data now shows a very powerful way of changing behavior. So thank you very much. Please, Lloyd.
Back in the first part of the talk, you had the European countries, and the last one on the right, I think, was Denmark. And it
had an opt-out rate of about 15%.
Sweden. Yes, exactly.
What was the difference there?
From what we can tell, it's a website. You don't have to do a forum, and you can. It's odd. You can either opt in or opt out. If you just want to express your preference, you go to the website. That's the only thing we can find. The website seems to be the big thing. Please, Frank.
I'm sure you get asked this question a lot, but what about voter registration?
Obviously, this whole area of choice architecture has the potential of being politicized. But certainly voter registration, if you were motor voter type legislation, is that the kind of thing you're talking about? Would increase, I mean, I think, a great example, just steal a little bit, a very nice example of NOAA's stuff is in voter turnout. You can't make people vote, but Hillary Clinton in her senatorial campaign in 2006 ran ads that said, think about the tragedy of thousands of people who aren't voting. Todd Rogers, who's a friend, actually went to the Democratic and Republican convention and actually asked people, which do you think is better, worrying about those who aren't voting or telling them who is voting? And the data show clearly if you want to get people to vote, the way you get them to vote is tell them how many other people are voting. So it's just one other good example of this. I think, registration is obviously a case, just like organ donation, where changing what the default would be. Are you a felon? No. Okay, you're registered. Or felon, citizen. I mean, it would make a big difference, quite clearly. But I haven't been asked that much, actually. Please.
Sort of a straightforward question that Noah got to, I guess, but this is kind of a main effect story. The defaults increase, the behavior that's selected by the default. Mm-hmm. But there must be some people or some situations in which defaults are more or less influential than others. Have you looked into
the faster? I can give you a small list. The faster the decision, the more the default effect. The more expert the decision maker, the less the default effect. To give you 2, the more I know about I suspect, in fact, we sort of have the goods in this. The more loss averse I am for the attribute, the more the default effect. So we have some set of pretty logical, nothing terribly counterintuitive, but things you would expect. Please.
So it seems lately a lot of companies are using defaults to their advantage. So I'm thinking of certain airlines that the default is always something I actually don't want, and so I actually have to think and act, not to pay extra money. And I'm wondering if you know of any legislative activity to protect consumers from this use of defaults, or if you even think that's appropriate.
We don't have the best demonstration yet, but sort of like Noah's argument, people don't think defaults make that much of a difference to them. So I think legislators, being people, typically think this stuff isn't making a difference. So the database is relatively new, but no, I don't know. it's actually you get this very interesting world now where people are actually arguing, well, we don't think the default is going to make a difference. We're going to let you change it anyway. Yeah, and that's something that you're hearing in Washington from certain quarters now, which I find fascinating. But no, I don't know of any active legislation, particularly in the domain. The FTC is involved in some cases, I can tell you, where they're really interested in firms that use defaults, not quite as nicely as you're talking about, but who are clearly over the line deceptive. And that actually goes in questions of what's deceptive, but that's a whole other set of questions.
In your slide on GLAM,
Yes.
in passing you mentioned that when you set the default to the more expensive engine, it doubled the rate at which people were choosing the engine. And then you mentioned that that wasn't, because that was inconsistent with what people chose independently, that somehow that was a bad decision.
Well, it's a
Talk
good
more about that.
It's a good question. Ultimately, when you leave the world of saying people know their utilities and that's what they're maximizing, life gets more complicated. Life gets, that's it's an obvious thing, but what it does say is, are they making choices that they actually will approve of afterwards? A choice becomes a prediction about how we will feel 2 years, 3 years. We don't have that data. We simply can match that.
You would expect that at some point there'd be some regret factor, and they'd be like, this is too big an engine. Or some,
yeah, but we also, we have not done. Actually, interestingly, GLAM has not been interested in following up. Yeah. So I actually a place that I'm very a place that actually this is very interesting. We're talking to the Social Security Administration's retirement. 50%, over half the people retire at 62 now, which shocked me. I mean, I was. But the question: if you were to do a study, would they be happier at 62 or retiring at 65? That's a place where I think we can do that kind of work. So it's a very good question, Greg. I wish I had a better answer for you. But that data doesn't happen quickly. Please.
I was puzzled by what do you do with data after you switch to the default to something that was previously the most popular choice? If the default becomes the popular choice and it doubles or triples the effect, how would you ever know again what the consumers really do want?
Yeah, I mean, so
you're selling them the thing you thought they wanted.
One of the reasons that flowchart is so complicated is it's conditioned on what do you know about consumers' taste ahead of time. And so as you point out, if I'm actually going to change the default, I'm losing data about what they really want. So that's, I mean, firms, now, I don't have, this is Silicon Valley, they're running many experiments to try and find, conditions to optimize things like web advertising, websites, and they could also do similar experimentation to see what do people want and what's the relative effect of defaults and other kinds of choice architecture. But yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, you have to realize that when you make a decision, you can be losing information. It's very good. Please. Yeah.
I was wondering if there's any sort of time series studies. On the internet, frequently, all of us know that whenever you sign up for something, there's that box to say, yes, I want my my email box filled with your MC marketing material, and it's pre-checked. And so, the first few times it happens, you say, oh my God, and then you start looking. I start at least looking for that box to de-check it, to opt out. And I wonder if you've had an opportunity to do any sort of longitudinal surveys. How long does it take us when we have the same annoying choice that we're being opted into involuntarily to kind of learn to back out?
Of course people learn, and they learn, but of course firms get smarter too, and perhaps do a better job of making sure the button is below the scroll bar. So, I mean, I suspect you're right, but I suspect that any answer about how much they learn is going to have to be conditioned on how much firms learn. So it's sort of a little bit of a Red Queen's race. So I think it's a great question. We just haven't pursued it. We have data on the kind of email stuff, and that's a factor of 2. You get twice as many people opting in for email. If you pre-check the box, then you have to check in to get it. So that's true. I just don't know what happens over time. It's a great question.
Thanks again.
Thank you.